This video tutorial introduces the use of Raven selection tables for making measurements on selections. We cover the concepts of uncommitted versus committed selections, active and inactive selections, sorting and renumbering selections, adding measurements, measurement presets, displaying plottable measurement overlays on sound views, and showing and hiding selections in the sound views. Saving, retrieving, and exporting selection tables are covered in a later video. I'll be working with Raven Pro 1.5 on a Mac. If you use Raven on Windows or Linux, a few details of the interface may look slightly different, but all of Raven's functionality is the same across all operating systems. For this demonstration, I'll be working with the chestnut-sided warbler sound file from the Raven examples folder. For the moment, I'm going to hide the waveform view. Recall that we can select a portion of a sound by drawing a box around it on the spectrogram or on the waveform with the mouse. A new selection is shown by a dashed red border. Selections in Raven are the key to making measurements. In order to see some measurements associated with the selection I've made, I'm going to grab this horizontal bar below the scroll bar at the bottom of the sound window and drag it up to reveal the selection table. The selection table, which looks similar to a spreadsheet, is where Raven displays measurements on rectangular selections that I make. By default, it displays 4 columns: begin time, end time, low frequency, and high frequency. These values define the 4 sides of the selection box. I can resize the selection box by dragging any one of the small square selection handles at the corners or sides of the box. As I resize the box, notice that the values for the box boundaries shown in the selection table change accordingly. Raven can display many other measurements in addition to the 4 selection bounds. We'll see how to add other measurements to the table shortly. Notice that if I draw a second selection box, the first one disappears. By default, new selections in Raven are uncommitted. An uncommitted selection disappears as soon as you start creating another selection. Uncommitted selections have dashed boundaries. If you want a selection to persist, you must commit it by pressing Enter immediately after you finish drawing the selection box. So if I redraw this selection around this last syllable, when I press Enter to commit the selection border changes from a dashed line to a solid line. Now that the selection is committed, I can draw a second selection, and the first one persists. When I create a second selection, the border of the first selection, which I've now committed, changes color from red to cyan. Let's make a few more selections. Remember that immediately after drawing a selection, I need to press Enter to commit it. The selection that I drew most recently is outlined in red, while all of the others are in cyan. The one selection in red is called the active selection. In the selection table, the active selection is indicated by a red box next to its selection ID. Inactive selections are marked by cyan boxes. A selection table can have any number of selections in it, but only one selection can be active at a time. There are 2 ways to choose which selection should be active. First, you can click anywhere on its row in the selection table. So as I click around in the selection table, you can see that different selections are outlined in red to indicate that they are the active selection. You can also activate a selection by clicking on it in the spectrogram or waveform view while holding the Alt and Shift keys on Windows or the Option and Shift keys on a Mac. Notice that when I hold the Option-Shift key combination and click, the mouse pointer changes from its default crosshair shape to a pointing finger to indicate that I'm now in Activate Selection mode. With the pointer in Activate Selection mode, I can activate selections by simply clicking on them, again while holding the Option and Shift keys on a Mac or the Alt and Shift keys on Windows. The active selection is the one that plays when you click the play button. The active selection is also the one that Raven will zoom to if you click the Zoom to Selection button in the lower right corner of the signal window. I'll now zoom back to the full time extent and the full frequency extent and zoom in to the scale I was at before. If I turn the display of the waveform view back on by clicking in the sidebar here, each selection in the table is represented on 2 rows, one each for the waveform and spectrogram views. In the View column of the table, the rows for the 2 views are marked by little icons representing the waveform and spectrogram views. If I hide a view, its rows will be hidden from the table. So I can hide the spectrogram view, and now all I have is the rows from the table for the waveform with their little blue markers in the View column, and if I turn the spectrogram back on and hide the waveform, I see just the spectrogram entries. For now, let's leave the waveform hidden to simplify the table. Raven assigns sequential selection ID numbers in the order that I make selections. The selection ID is shown just above the selection box in the spectrogram and in the selection column of the table. In this case, the selections are not numbered in a logical order from left to right because I initially made them in a different order. The first selection I created was the last syllable of the song. What if I want them numbered from left to right? Do I have to start all over, carefully creating them in the right order? There's actually an easier way. Raven can renumber the selections in left to right order for me. To do this, I take advantage of the fact that Raven can sort the entries in the selection table based on the values in any column. By default, Raven sorts the entries by selection ID. However, we can sort on any other column in the table by clicking the column header. So, to sort the table so that the selections are displayed in order of their time in the signal, I can click on the Begin Time column header. Now the selections are listed in order of their time in the recording, but the selection ID numbering is still based on the order in which I created the selections. To renumber the selections according to the current sort order of the table, right-click or control-click on a Mac anywhere in the column header area of the table and choose Renumber Selections from the menu. Since the table was sorted in order of increasing begin time, the new selection ID numbers shown above the selections in the spectrogram are now in the order I want. Raven has many measurements available for selections in addition to the 4 selection boundary values that are always displayed. To choose which measurements are displayed in the selection table, right-click or control-click on a Mac anywhere in the header of the selection table and select Choose Measurements from the menu. In the dialog that appears, the left list shows the measurements that are currently displayed in the table. The right list shows all of the other measurements that are available, listed in alphabetical order. Let's add a measure of duration called delta time to the selection table. To do this, I scroll down the list till I find delta time alphabetically. There it is. Then I click once on delta time in the list and click on the left pointing arrow between the two lists. Let's now add two more measurements, peak frequency and peak time, to the table. This time, I'm going to add the measurements by just double-clicking on their names in the right list to add them to the selection table. So here's peak frequency. And notice that when I add a measurement to the table, it immediately appears in the table as soon as I add it. So if I add peak time by double-clicking, it appears immediately in the table. If I want to reuse this combination of measurements in the future without adding them one at a time, I can save a measurement preset by clicking on the Preset menu and choosing Save As. In the dialog that appears, I need to specify a name for the preset. Let's call it My Preset 1. Then click Save. Now I can quickly switch back to the default set of 4 basic measurements by choosing Default from the Preset menu, and then quickly add the 3 measurements that I had in the preset back in again by choosing the preset that I just created from the menu. You can save as many presets as you want for different projects or applications. I'll now click OK to dismiss the Choose Measurements dialog. Some measurements can be visualized as overlays on the spectrogram and other Raven views. To display such plottable measurements, click on the Measurements checkbox in the side panel. Now, the peak frequency and peak time are shown on the spectrogram by horizontal and vertical green lines in each selection box, and the column headers for those measurements are also green. Peak frequency and peak time refer to the frequency and time at which the maximum power spectral density, represented by the darkest pixel in the spectrogram image, occurs within the selection. Other measurements, some of which we'll introduce in later videos, are shown in different colors, which match the colors of their respective column headers in the table. At any time, you can toggle the display of selections in the sound views on and off by clicking the Draw checkbox above the selection table. This concludes our introduction to measurements and selection tables. We'll discuss saving, retrieving, and exporting selection tables in a later video. Thanks for watching.